Light in the world, world in the mind, mind in the heart, heart in the night, pain in the day, strength in the pain, light in the strength, world in the light. That is a poem by Owen Barfield. It's one of his later poems. It came out in 1971. But I wanted to read it to start out, to kind of reset us as we continue visiting with the works of Owen Barfield, sometimes called the first and last Inkling, the dear friend of C.S. Lewis, as we discussed at some length last week. And I said then that we were going to keep kind of digging into his philosophy more generally, which is what we're going to now go on to do. I really want us to take our time with this guy because he's a complex and strange thinker. He's an offbeat writer and sometimes a difficult writer, but I also think that he is a missing puzzle piece in our intellectual landscape. He's like, the key to life, the universe, and everything. This one weird trick, like they say online. There's just so much in his work that I think really deserves our attention. So we're going to kind of keep digging into Owen Barfield today and next week, and then that'll probably bring us to the end. And this is going to be one of those wide-ranging episodes. We won't just stick with Barfield. We're going to be talking about quantum physics and the multiverse a little bit, some more. I'm going to read to you a portion from my book, How to Save the West, which is coming up. And hopefully by the time we're done, we will get a sense of how some of the philosophy of perception and matter and form that we were talking about last week locks together with Barfield's writing about language and the way that language works. And I read a poem to start off so that you could become familiar with the idea that this is not just a, abstract philosophical thinker, although he is that. This is also a poet. He wrote poetry throughout his life, especially early on in his career. He was a lawyer on top of that. He managed C.S. Lewis's legal concerns, but also just practiced law more generally. And so he has this really interesting combination of expertises that come together in these weird little books. And you can get them now pretty nicely bound. They're reissuing them. And so today I wanted to focus mostly on this book called Poetic Diction. And that's the language part of this equation. We're gonna talk a little bit about how he understands language, especially poetic language. And then we're going to move from that kind of back to the stuff we were talking about with saving the appearances and perception. We'll see how these two things are linked together and how, as a whole, they give us, I think, a really promising way forward for some of the difficulties that we're up against in the modern world. Barfield, along with maybe Friedrich Nietzsche, who's another person we've talked about on this podcast before, Barfield was one of the few, I think, philosophers who actually took seriously and understood the challenges posed by modern science to everything that we think and believe and hold dear. There's a kind of a halfway house here that a lot of people occupy, where they'll be like, oh, well, science has disproven God, or science has, moved us beyond the need for primitive superstitions, and we can just, develop material prosperity through the manipulation of matter, and that's going to be fine and dandy, and we're all also going to live in a utopian, hunky-dory society where everybody gets along and everybody's moral. And one of Nietzsche's great kind of arguments throughout his career was that's not going actually to fly. You can jettison, your old sense of the sacred, your old idea of permanent and enduring truths, but you can't keep your nice, comfortable morality along with it. You eventually that's going to go. It might stick around for a little while just out of habit, but eventually society is going to start to fray around the edges. And this is the Nietzschean prediction that I think is really coming true in our day. It's taken us this long to see that we can't just cut the root out from under the tree of Western civilization. And those roots are Judeo-Christian in large part, right? You can't cut those roots away and expect the tree to keep bearing fruit, keep giving you all this nice art, all these lovely morals, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of, one way in which Nietzsche saw and took seriously the significance of these, of the scientific revolution. And even more than that, I think of the Darwinian revolution and kind of the 19th century, flowering of something like materialism, or you might call it positivism, which is this idea of a kind of reductive materialist world. Barfield, who is a very different guy in a lot of ways and does believe in God and is religious, nevertheless also sees that science is leading average people to talk in ways that kind of belie their actions. So people continue to act morally. They continue to, build nice societies and go about their lives in kind of quiet and comfortable ways. And yet they're talking about discoveries in science that completely undermine or explode the ways that they are thinking. They'll say, there's just matter. But then they'll talk about, or we'll learn in quantum physics, that actually matter is a very mysterious thing, something that we only experience through our perception. And when we stop perceiving it, it seems to either behave in ways that are beyond our comprehension, or to do all sorts of things that make us very uncomfortable, or maybe we just don't know anything at all about matter when we stop looking at it. We have this kind of idea that it just exists in this, that the way we experience the material world is the way that it all, it continues to behave when we turn our heads. But quantum physics actually kind of teaches us that that's not the case. And so Barfield observes, that's part of what we talked about last week, right? That when we accept those conclusions, those discoveries from quantum physics, and that go on to talk as if we can just be simple materialists and believe in this, mechanistic universe, we've created this incredible contradiction. And so I want to talk over the next few weeks about how he solves this contradiction. And like I said, I want to begin by approaching it from his philosophy on language. This is in some ways his earliest book. It was his undergraduate thesis. It's called Poetic Diction. It changed my life when I discovered it at Oxford. It just totally blew my mind. And I've been waiting for a while to talk about it. So I'm really excited to dig into it with you guys. Let me talk to you about everything you can do with Rocket Money. This is the artist formerly known as Truebill. If you've been following me for a while, all the stuff that you know and love about Truebill, which helps you to cancel unwanted subscriptions, is now still true as they make their transition into Rocket Money. This is a really cool service that goes beyond even what they were already doing. They've been growing and growing. They help over 3.4 million people now with budgeting, lowering bills, canceling subscriptions, and more. They save each of their members on average $700 a year. That is no small thing, and they could save you much more. They're everything that you've always loved and I've always loved about Truebill, but with a fresh look and feel. They can really help you get your finances into order, which is awesome. I've been thinking about that more lately after getting married. When you combine your finances, you just do a general kind of review. Rocket Money is awesome for that sort of overall holistic approach. It's also great if you just want to, daily keep up the maintenance on your finances. This stuff is super important, especially in a weird and volatile economy like we're in. When you go to rocketmoney.com/heretics, you can start canceling your unused subscriptions and saving money. It's rocketmoney.com/heretics. I am not the only person who has stumbled across a book like Poetic Diction and thought it explained so much of what I was already kind of thinking about and intuiting. And so people have gotten interested in Barfield. In some ways, they've gotten interested in him through C.S. Lewis, because Lewis was obviously so much more famous than Barfield and loved Barfield very dearly and had these profound, we talked last week about the kind of tensions in their friendship that eventually led Lewis to theism, right? Before he became a Christian, he had to come to believe in God, and Barfield was instrumental in that process. And so people have been rediscovering Barfield through that in some ways. And once you get to this book, I want to try to lead us into it. And like I say, to take our time with it, because as I read, you'll see that his premise is it's not intuitive to a modern mind. Let's put it this way. It's sort of shocking and difficult to untangle. So let me read to you what I think is an important passage that kind of lays out one of his major claims here. Barfield writes, "The most conspicuous point of contact between meaning and poetry is metaphor. So this is a book about the kind of pleasure and truth we derive from poetry. What is poetry, and why is poetry a sort of language that we revere or feel excited about? The most conspicuous point of contact between meaning and poetry is metaphor. For one of the first things that a student of etymology, even quite an amateur student, discovers for himself is that every modern language, with its thousands of abstract terms and its nuances of meaning and association, is apparently nothing from beginning to end but an unconscionable tissue of dead or petrified metaphors. I have talked about this before on the show. If you've heard me rant about dead metaphor in language, I get it, a lot of it from Barfield. Let's keep going, and then I'm going to comment on some of this stuff. If we trace the meanings of a great many words, or those of the elements of which they are composed, about as far back as etymology can take us, we are at once made to realize that an overwhelming proportion, if not all of them, referred in earlier days to one of these two things: a solid, sensible object, or some animal, probably human, activity. Examples abound on every page of the dictionary. Thus, an apparently objective scientific term like elasticity on the one hand and the metaphysical abstract on the other are both traceable to verbs meaning draw or drag. Centrifugal and centripetal are composed of a noun meaning a goad and verbs signifying to flee and to seek, respectively. Epithet, theme, thesis, anathema, hypothesis, etc. go back to a Greek verb to put. This is the verb tithemi, which gives us all those words, right? And even right and wrong, it seems, once had the meanings of stretched and so straight and ringing or sour. Some philologists, looking still further back into the past, have resolved these two classes into one, but this is immaterial to the point at issue. So Barfield is pointing something out which is going to become incredibly important as we start to talk about the religious aspects of this apparently kind of obscure etymological theory. He's pointing out that in our everyday speech, we have all of these words and ways of talking, and this has only gotten worse in some ways since Barfield wrote this book. In our everyday speech, we use these words that we think of as having no physical content, that they just refer to pure concepts, right? That something like abstract, something like spiritual, something like ideological, we toss these words around and they enter into our lexicon. And if we ever knew exactly what they mean, we gradually forget, and we just come to use them as kind of pegs to hang these ideas on. But once you get down to the etymology of them, the premise of Poetic Diction is that they reveal themselves, these supposedly abstract words, to have physical substrata, underpinnings that are physical. When he talks about abstract, which comes from traho in Latin, to drag, right, to drag away, and so actually, even though we think of ourselves as being able in language to transcend the material world, in fact, we are always in a kind of union between matter and form, body and soul. We're always using what he calls dead metaphor, because what's a metaphor, right? A metaphor is when you take some image or some concrete physical thing and you use it to stand in for some other activity or event or something, and often they can get very abstract. This is a simile, right? But, metaphor and simile are both forms of analogy, right? My love is like a red, red rose. Or you might even say, my love is a red, red rose, right? You take this physical thing and you apply its qualities to the supposedly non-physical or spiritual properties of some abstract thing like love. And yet, right, even when you use these abstract words, you're always employing these kind of metaphors, these tools and symbols. And what Barfield is going to argue is that this is all language is, that there's no point at which we have abstract words that just, float in some ether. We are always, even when we use grunts and scratch in the dirt with sticks, right? At any point in the development of language, we are always taking these physical things, sounds, images, right? Human contact with objects, and we're using them to stand in for concept. And one of the things that typically we tend to assume out of this, the kind of modern materialist way of interpreting this fact would be to say, well, this just proves that all of those airy-fairy philosophical ideals, right? The things like abstraction and love, right? Those are actually insubstantial. They don't exist. All it is just matter bouncing around and shoving up against itself. But if that were the case, there would be no reason to use language at all, because language, right, is this form of metaphor, right? It's using stuff to stand in for other stuff. So it must be the case that actually we do have contact with things that go beyond our senses, things like love that can't be captured fully in any one physical act or activity or even sensation, and yet, right, are only present to us, are only available to us in physical sensations and experiences. You take a word like love, right? And you know that you're talking about something, and you can recognize it in a million different physical ways, right? You can see somebody giving bread to a homeless person. You can see somebody holding a lover in his arms. You can be yourself the lover, and you can feel the tingle down the back of your spine. These are all physical, material things that occur. And yet, right, the thing called love, which is a thing and has an existence, is recognizable in all of these drastically different material experiences. At the same time, you have never just had a face-to-face encounter with love itself without any physical mediation. And every time you think that you've had that kind of encounter, you turn out to be wrong. So let's say even something simpler like a circle, right? You've seen metal circles, wooden circles, but the concept of circle, like the concept of love, it goes beyond any physical example. And you think you can be like, oh yes, but I can just picture a circle with no material. Try doing it as you're listening to me. Try picturing a circle. What happens? You get basically a white sheet of paper visualized in your head, and you get a black ink circle, or you get whatever color it happens to be in your mind, right? Even though you know that the circle is something beyond matter, you only ever experience it in matter. The same thing is true of love. The same thing is true of everything that matters in human experience: memory, desire, dreams. Aristotle says about this very beautifully that thought is not the same thing as perception or fantasia or sense experience or anything like that. And yet it never happens without perception or fantasia. Fantasia is a better word to use than perception, because it's not aesthesis, right? It's like the word that we get fantasy from, the kind of image in our mind. We never think without those images, even when we think we're doing it. And this is Barfield's point about language, which is why it's more than just a kind of etymological curiosity that words like abstract come from a Latin word meaning to drag, right? It actually tells us something about the structure of all language, the way that it always works, because that's the way that our whole human experience works. And the errors that we fall into, both ancient and modern, almost all have to do with imagining ourselves to be living purely in one extreme. Either we imagine ourselves to only be having a physical experience, talking about physical objects, but this is kind of what Barfield thinks is exploded by quantum physics, more on that later, or we imagine ourselves to be in the pure Platonic realm of the forms, and we can float up, and we have like a gender, right, which goes beyond, which is not connected in any way to our body, that has no reference to this flesh. And the reason why that kind of philosophy ends us up in these horrific contortions and causes us to do things that are really ugly to our bodies and to the bodies of others, is because it's a false idea of abstraction, that we can just float out of any material container into a pure realm of the forms. And Barfield is saying, in language as in life, the two things are always unified and connected. So let's read another very important passage from this book in which he develops this argument further in his sort of lawyerly way. So he's quoting here, Barfield says, 150 years ago, Dr. Hugh Blair wrote in his Lectures on Rhetoric, "We are apt, upon a superficial view, to imagine that those modes of expression which are called figures of speech are among the chief refinements of speech, not invented till after language had advanced to its late periods, and mankind were brought into a polished state, and that then they were devised by orators and rhetoricians. The contrary of this is the truth. Mankind never employed so many figures of speech as when they had hardly any words for expressing their meaning. For, first, the want of proper names for every object obliged them to use one name for many, and, of course, to express themselves by comparisons, metaphors, allusions, and all those substituted forms of speech which render language figurative. Next, as the objects with which they were most conversant were the sensible, material objects around them, names would be given to these objects long before words were invented for signifying the dispositions of the mind or any sort of moral and intellectual ideas. Hence, the early language of men being entirely made up of words descriptive of sensible objects, it became, of necessity, extremely metaphorical. And so this is a view that Barfield is now going to criticize. So this guy Blair is saying, language begins in just a purely physical way. It begins with, and this is kind of that one extreme that I was talking about. Language begins almost purely materialist and describes physical sensations and perceptions and experiences. And then once we become aware of these more refined, as it were, abstract, spiritual, platonic, concepts, sort of call them whatever you want, right? Form and matter, right? These are the form. Once we become more aware of the world of the forms, then we start taking the matter, these words that describe purely physical realities, and applying that matter in a metaphorical way to the forms. This appears, says Barfield, to be a conception of language which, since the time of Locke, has been held by most people who have troubled to write on the subject. Yet it proves, unless one stretches the meaning of such words as metaphor and trope intolerably far, to be quite unreasonable. For how is it arrived at? In this way. 1. The theorist beholds metaphors and similitudes being invented by poets and others in his own time. 2. Examining the more recent history of language, he finds many examples of such metaphors having actually become a part of language, that is to say, having become meanings. Delving deeper still into etymology, he discovers that all our words were at one time, quote, the names of sensible objects, and 4, he jumps to the conclusion that they therefore, at that time, had no other meaning. From these 4 observations, he proceeds to deduce, fifthly, that the application of these names of sensible objects to what we now call insensible objects was deliberately, quote, metaphorical. In other words, although when he moves backwards through the history of language, he finds it becoming more and more figurative with every step, yet he has no hesitation in assuming a period still further back when it was not figurative at all. To supply, therefore, the missing link in his chain of linguistic evolution, he proceeds to people the infancy of society with an exalted race of amateur poets. Thus, Max Müller, in his Science of Language, speaks with confidence of the metaphorical period, describing how spiritus in Latin originally meant blowing or wind, and so on and so forth. So this is Barfield's great insight, is that many, many theories of language, both casual and formal, begin from the assumption that language is purely physical and then becomes, as it were, metaphorical. And what Barfield is saying is language is always metaphorical. It's always both physical and spiritual, right, at the same time. And this becomes also his definition of poetry and poetic diction, which is the recognition and the reanimation of a dead metaphor. And so this is what we're going to get into next, is how poetry works for Barfield by finding those resonances, like, that spirit means breath and wind and the Holy Spirit, right, at the same time, and using that language to recover all of those old meanings and to create this union again between the flesh and the spirit of the word, which both live together always in the same sound or image or idea. So let's give an example of this next. So you guys know I like to keep healthy. I like to work out a lot. And that is why I'm so excited to tell you about our new sponsor, Field of Greens. There's a lot of talk about supplements, especially among people that lift weights, but just generally in the wellness and fitness space. And I have been really choosy about what kind of supplements, if any, I was going to bring to you as a sponsor, because there's so much gunk out there and it can get really gross and weird. For those of you that have asked, yes, I am natty, which is internet slang for natural. I do not take steroids. And that's actually why I really love Field of Greens, because one of the things that is really hard to incorporate into your nutrition is this, doctor recommended 6 cups a day of veggies and fruits. That is so much vegetables and fruits. I do not have time to pound that while I'm also pounding like protein and meats and stuff. So Field of Greens fixes this problem. It's a full spectrum of essential vegetables and fruits, plus science-backed herbs and prebiotics that you need to stay healthy. It works fast. You will have more energy. You will look and feel healthier. It's great for your skin. And if you're trying to lose weight, it can help with that too. So join me in taking Field of Greens. You can get 15% off for your first order and another 10% when you subscribe for recurring orders. A really good deal for Young Heretics listeners. Visit fieldofgreens.com and use promo code Heretics. It's fieldofgreens.com, promo code Heretics. Okay, so stick with me. We've got two concepts now, right? We've got the idea that language is always both physical and, as it were, metaphorical or conceptual, right? That words like concept don't just apply to these rarefied a physical experience. They actually take our physical experience and invest it with what it has, which is a spiritual meaning or significance, right? Then we have this next concept, which is that in poetry, what we do is we recover the old original unified sense that we used to have. Because his whole idea, and we got into this a little bit with Saving the Appearances, his whole idea is that the original experience of a thing like spirit, right? A word which means, breath and wind. Pneuma in Greek is a good example of this. Ruach in Hebrew, right? It means this physical thing, which is breath. It means another kind of physical phenomenon, which is wind, and it means this abstract concept, which we call spirit, right? But his argument is that originally the perception, not just the words for those things, but the experience of them was unified. There was less of an ability to make that, easy distinction that we now make between, oh, well, I'm having a movement of the spirit versus the wind is blowing. And eventually we're going to get to his treatment of this passage in the Gospels where Jesus says that the wind blows where it pleases. But first, let's read another one of his examples, which I think is really great. And it's on this word ruin in our English language, which comes from a Latin word ruo, R-U-O. English schoolboys are generally taught to translate the Latin verb ruo by one of two words, rush or fall. And it does indeed mean both these things, but because it means both, and because it also means a great deal more, neither rendering alone is really an adequate equivalent. In the classical contexts themselves, it nearly always carries with it a larger sense of swift, disastrous movement. Ruit arduus aether, of a deluge of rain, and again, fiat justitia ruat caelum. Let justice come to be, let justice come to pass, and let the heavens run down. Why is this? The Greek reo, to flow, and similar words in other European languages, whether philologists admit a lineal connection is a matter of comparative indifference for periods so remote, suggests that the old rumbling guttural R, which our modern palates have so thinned and refined, once had its concrete connection with swift natural movements, such as those of torrents or landslides. This is an idea about language which you don't have to believe this or accept this in order to accept what Barfield is saying. The part of the argument in the Cratylus or the Cratylus, depending on how you pronounce your Greek, which is a dialogue by Plato in which Socrates kind of traces all the rudiments of the Greek language to this physical version of some concept. But he's basically arguing here, right, that ruo and reo, flowing and ruining or falling or rushing, it initially refers to one unified human experience that is both physical and more than physical, spiritual, you might say, physical and beyond physical. Now, he says, the conscious realization by men that such motions, with the noise that accompanies them, are often the prelude to disaster, may or may not have been the cause why Ruo came to convey in such a lively manner the notion not only of movement, but also of collapse. If so, then we are already at the, quote, metaphorical stage, and the transition from given to created meaning has begun even before the first recorded use. If not, then an older, single meaning, rush, fall, collapse, has begun, under the influence of the rational, to split up into this treble meaning of the Latin word, which is subsequently going to require three separate words for its expression. In any case, it is noticeable that when the substantive ruina came to be formed, it contained this last part only of the meaning of the verb. In other words, the older meaning, whether still wholly given or containing by now a created element, was now being further restricted, hardened, arrested under the influence of the rational principle. And another change soon took place. It could now mean not only the falling itself, but the thing fallen. It is like watching a physical process of crystallization. This is really key, even though, again, Barfield's writing is not always so clear. Let's try, if I can, to break it down here, right? A single older meaning, rush, fall, collapse. This is that original experience that we're talking about, which Barfield is always trying to find ways of getting back to or reanimating in a conscious way. But unconsciously or just automatically, he believes, early man has these experiences that contain both physical and spiritual reality, form and matter in one. Rush, fall, collapse, right? And he suggests that those three meanings eventually began to branch out into separate words. And that's why, for instance, in English, we have the word spirit and breath, right? Two different ideas, rather than just one word in these older languages like ruach in Hebrew, right? That's his sort of his basic concept. His guide Maupassant said somewhere, les mots ont une âme, la plupart des lecteurs et même des écrivains ne leur demande qu'un son. This is another problem with this book. If you come to it fresh, is that he just leaves a lot of this stuff untranslated. I will be translating for you. You can thank me later. So Guy de Maupassant said somewhere, words have a soul. Most readers and even writers don't ask of them anything other than a meaning. Il faut trouver cette âme qui apparaît au contact d'autres mots. It is necessary to find this soul, which appears in contact with other words. This is the idea of poetic diction, that it joins these words together and creates metaphor that reanimates old natural metaphor, or that recreates the unity of form and matter, flesh and spirit. So the words au contact d'autres mots, this is in contact with other words, which remind us of the tag from the Ars Poetica, notum si callida verbum rediderit junctura novum. This is Horace's Art of Poetry, right? The Augustan era Latin imperial poet who writes a sort of instruction poem on how to write good poetry. He's saying you will speak well, you will make good poetry if, and this is translating Barfield's Latin here, if a clever conjunction should give new meaning to a well-known word. So if you've got a word that, like abstract, that you already know, you think you have this grasp on it, it's kind of become this subconscious dead metaphor in your usage, and then you can join it to other words and suddenly see that it has this dragging property, right? That's poetry in some ways, right? This is particularly important, says Barfield, for this contact with other words is the precise point at which the potential new meaning originally enters language. And it is by quotations illustrating such contacts that I am trying to trace the gradual loss of ancient meaning, given or created from the word ruin, the recovery of part of it, and the positive gain which, thanks to individual poets, arises out of that sequence of loss and recovery. In Latin, then, the four letters R-U-I-N never lost the power to suggest movement. In certain contexts, they may seem to modern readers to possess a purely static and material reference, but if so, it is because those readers are of the kind described by Maupassant as demanding only a son, a definable meaning. The soul of such a word as ruina is really inseparable from motion. So this idea that there's a soul to words, right, is one of the ways that you can get beneath the skin of a new language. If you're learning a new language right now, I know a lot of people that are out there listening are learning new languages, Japanese or Latin, or maybe a modern language. And this is, I'm learning Japanese right now, and there's this sense that words don't just come with these literal meanings. They also have contained within them the the soul, right? And uncovering them is part of what this book kind of helps you to do, right? Si fractus illabatur orbis. This is a quote from Horace again, Ode 3, book 3 of the Odes, poem number 3, Ode number 3. Si fractus illabatur orbis impavidum ferient ruinae. And he's talking here about the stoic man, or the man of good, sturdy character. If the world, broken, should collapse, right? The ruins, the ruinae, would pour down upon an unafraid head, right? That ruinae, he's pointing out that this is like, let the heavens pour down. That when Horace uses the word ruin, it doesn't just mean like the broken pieces. It means an actual physical motion that eventually then becomes the sort of more abstract or metaphorical idea of ruin. Before 1375, the word ruin, with the meaning a falling, had come via France to England, and we find Chaucer using it in that sense. Thus, Saturn in the Knight's Tale, boasting of his powers, proclaims to Venus, "Mine is the ruin of the high halls, the falling of the towers and of the walls." Here is the word in poetic use, mobile and vigorous enough, but without its modern subtlety, because in English it has as yet no solid associations to give it weight and deepen its private significance. Remember, we've talked about this before also on the podcast, that English goes through these successive phases. There's sort of three big periods. The first one is purely Anglo-Saxon Old English, right, which is Germanic with all these German roots. And then in this kind of sedimentary process, as Seamus Heaney points out, right, it's like sedimentary layers. In 1066, you have the conquest, the Battle of Hastings and the Norman Conquest, and all this French starts flooding into the language. And so Barfield is saying you've got this new word coming from Latin via French into English, and it has this sense of falling, even though it doesn't have the same kind of history behind it. So here's another quote. This is from Gower. "The wall and all the site within stand in ruins and in decay, where we should now say stand in ruins, and think at once not of a process or a state," which is Gower's meaning, "but of the actual fragments of masonry." So he goes on to describe how this kind of calcification process or crystallization process happens, and how poetry can recover this sense, even the sense of motion in the word ruin, even as it passes out. And all poetry, he argues, is like this. What does this have to do with quantum physics, with our experience, with science, with any of these other things, right? Well, let me read to you one last passage from Poetic Diction, and then I'm going to switch over to C.S. Lewis, famous for his expertise at explaining things clearly. And this is going to be our transition out of thinking about language into thinking about religion. And from thinking about religion, we're going to go to thinking about physics and reality and our present predicament, okay? So as I mentioned to you, right, this is this passage in John's gospel he's dealing with here, in which Jesus is visited by an elder of the synagogue named Nicodemus. And Nicodemus has this very famous exchange with Jesus in which Jesus says to him, "You have to be born again," right? This is the passage from which comes much of the rite of baptism, much of the theology of baptism. And there's this very mysterious section in it in which Jesus says to Nicodemus, "You hear the sound of the wind. The wind blows where it pleases. You hear the sound, but you cannot tell from where it is come and where it is going." And this is also the word pneuma, which he uses for wind, or which the gospel rather uses for wind. And similarly, the word ruach in Hebrew, or that, the Aramaic word that Jesus may have been using at the time, right? All of these words have both the meaning of spirit, as in the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, and wind. So now, it is an indisputable fact that the further we look back into the history of the meanings of common words, the more closely we find them approximating to this latter concrete type. Thus, even as recently as the date of the composition of the fourth gospel, this is John chapter 3, we can hear in the Greek pneuma an echo of just such an old, concrete, undivided meaning, the meaning of both spirit and flesh contained in one, and the experience, the human experience recorded of encountering the same entity both in wind and in spirit, right? This meaning, and therefore in this case practically the whole sense of the passage, is lost in the inevitably double English rendering of spirit and wind. There are any number of other examples. Here I should be content to point to our seemingly arbitrary and now purely verbal allotment of emotion to the diverse parts of the body, such as the liver, the bowels, the heart, where in our own day an old single meaning survives as two separate references of the same word, a physical and a psychic. That is to say, he's saying even in the way that we talk about our bodies now, we use words that used to describe one unified entity, like the heart, right? Both a physical organ and a sort of spiritual encounter. And that now we have to kind of try to separate them, tease them apart, because we start to think about the physical and the spiritual as two separate things. And recovering that sense of their unity through metaphor is what he's talking about when he's talking about poetic diction. This is why he thinks poetry is so important. And this is why he thinks that the passages like the motion of the Spirit are so important. Barfield's favorite line in John's Gospel was, "In the beginning was the Word," and we're going to get more into that in a second as we go. But that the point of that, of preferring that line or of being interested in that line, is that if God's creation of the world is a form of language, right? That God speaks, "Let there be light," and there is light. Then this relationship between form and matter, physical and metaphysical, or more than physical, or beyond the physical. This relationship between form and matter in language is not an accident. It's a human image of how all of reality works. This is what's going to start leading us back into the actual, the saving the appearances, right? This is not just a kind of, fun experiment that we're thinking about, but in the language, in the way language works, we have a clue to the way our experience works. And so when Jesus says, the wind, the pneuma blows where it pleases, you hear the sound, but you cannot tell from where it has come, where it is going, right? He's talking about the Spirit of God, which is also present to him and to Nicodemus in this physical experience that they're having of the wind and of hearing it and of sensory experience. This is so crucial for our modern forms of skepticism because when we separate the physical and the spiritual, when we have this kind of idea that, well, there's kind of airy-fairy abstract stuff, even if we want to believe in God, even if we believe in things like love, if we separate them out into this kind of abstraction and then we put the physical world here and that's just dirty, false materialism, right? Then we actually lose the whole point of the incarnation, right? The incarnation is the Word made flesh, right? Then this is why theories of language are not just theories of language, right? They're theories actually of human experience. And the human experience is the experience of being an embodied soul, of being a soul that, as Aristotle says, if the eye were a body, its soul would be sight, right? It's not that there is some like ghost in the machine floating around through your body. It's that your body is this kind of matter, this arrangement of matter that has life potentially, that can be alive. It's a natural body. That means it has physis, which is spontaneous motion or growth, right? And therefore it has the potential to be alive. The soul is the first actuality of that potential, which by Aristotle means by this, again, let me use another comparison. When I have a brain, right? I can think things. That means that I am capable, as an adult human, I am capable of learning French. That means I have the potential of learning French. When I learn French, then I have actualized that potential. That potential becomes actual. However, I'm not constantly thinking in French or using the French language. In fact, most of the time, I'm not. And so I'm not in the second mode of actuality, as Aristotle would say, right? I haven't activated that potential 2 times over. I just have that first kind of potential, which is to say, I know French, right? The first actuality of my potential to know French is just knowing French, not using French or speaking French or actively doing anything, but just having the knowledge available to me. Aristotle says that the soul is the first actuality of a natural body having life potentially, meaning that you don't actually have to be doing any like life-related, being alive-related things. You can be asleep and so therefore not conscious. You can be, for instance, a baby in the womb, importantly, right? You can be a preborn human being and you could be brain dead, and yet you still have a soul because your soul is the fact of your life, right? It's your being alive. It's not a ghost in the machine. It's not some, gelatinous mass floating up in the air. It's the fact of your being alive, just as the meaning of a word is not some like abstract idea. It's the thing that is the idea that is encoded into the language that comes to us in the sounds and the letters and the writing. Take the simplest example of this, tree, right? A tree does not sound like T-R-E-E. It doesn't look like T-R-E-E. When I say the word tree to you, I could just as well say the word arbre to you, right? And yet I couldn't say nothing and just convey to you my idea of the tree. I'm always giving you something to stand in for or to contain, it's better to say, the idea of the tree. You, crucially, right, are not sinews and organs and bones. You are not just a lump of matter constructed in some such a way. That is a degrading and dehumanizing way to think about yourself. And if you think I'm drawing that out of thin air, that is the way that we talk about ourselves and one another, right? We had a serotonin spike. If you listen to John Mayer, right? I'm just dreaming of the next time we can go into another serotonin overflow. It's a love song about like being a chemistry set, right? We have this way of talking about ourselves. We know that that's wrong. We know that's dehumanizing. And the reason we know is because we're not those things, even though we don't occur without those things. Those things are not us, and yet we always have them, right? Every human being is made, that we have ever seen or touched, right, is made up of these physical components. This is why in the Bible it says, no one has ever seen God. And if you have not loved your neighbor, but you say you love God, you are a liar. Because even though God is above and beyond, and the soul and the spirit, right, is in this world beyond sense and touch, the only encounter we have with the divine image is in this physical experience of encounter with others and with ourselves and with one another, right? This is the way that the whole world works. There is no escaping it, and there's no wishing it away. There's no reducing yourself to just a chemistry set inside a sack of meat or whatever. Again, I know that I talk about like all this political stuff from time to time on this podcast. We talk about the trans stuff and talk about the materialism and the Dr. Fauci of it all and the reduction of everything to material science. And it's not because I want to like own the libs or harp on whatever. It's just because I want to point out, and this is the point of the book, which I'm going to be reading to you from, I think, probably next week, that it's just because I want to point out that underneath these fights, there are profound questions about the nature of us and the nature of our experience, which are precisely the questions that Barfield is answering in a way that can both preserve our sense of ourselves as spiritual beings and preserve our desire to believe in hashtag trust the science and believe in the findings of science and so on and so forth. The only problem with scientism rather than science is this idea that it gets us into a purely quote unquote objective, which is to say physical encounter with the world. It does not do that. Nothing does that. There is no such thing as a purely physical encounter with the world that is freighted with no metaphysical meaning, no concepts, no higher ideas. So I'm going to get into that now with one passage from C.S. Lewis before we wrap up for this week. And then we will move from the religion next week into some more of this sort of more spiritual and philosophical stuff about our relationship to science and our relationship to the outside world. One of the things that I do a lot now that I am a homeowner is I clean stuff. And that is why I can tell you that public goods soap is the only way to go. They do not only make soap, they make all sorts of basics, but I have particularly been loving their dish soap lately and their hand soap as well. And here's why. When you buy a soap at the grocery store, first of all, it's going to have all sorts of crazy chemicals in it that you don't even know like what they are. What are you putting onto your skin? I mean, there's like a lot of stuff that you would not want on your skin every day. You're going to make a lot of contact with this, so you want it to be clean. You know that public good stuff is clean. And also, you don't want to have this like bright blue, weird like neon floating around your otherwise nice kitchen. So public goods always packages everything in very sleek packaging. And that helps, I think, to represent the fact that everything they make is just really high quality stuff that you can trust not to have junk and garbage in it. They make food, they make toilet paper, shampoo, all sorts of basics. I really like their chocolate covered almonds. I rave about them all the time. And I love this deal that they give my listeners, which is when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout, you get $15 off your first order with no minimum purchase. That's $15 of free stuff at publicgoods.com/heretics. So story time from Spencer's life for just a brief moment here. I mentioned that I had this kind of mind-blowing experience of discovering poetic diction, being so excited that I had found this author who could say things to me that, I had sort of been half thinking in a kind of cloudy way. And yet here was somebody that actually also thinks this. And this is why last week, by the way, I started talking about the friendship between Barfield and Lewis and some of Lewis's writing on friendship, because Lewis says about friendship that what you have, the experience you have when you make a true friend is, you too. I thought I was the only one, right? And this is why books are so important to me and to, I imagine, everybody who reads, who listens to this podcast, right? The people who are here are either here because, this is an experience that they have had with literature too, or it's something that you feel a longing for. It's a very lonely life not to read, right? And I know that, a lot of the stuff we talk about on this show can be very heady and difficult, right? Very highfalutin. And yet, right, the fundamental experience that we're trying to get down to here is to encounter another mind, right, that sees the things in the world that we see. And it's very rare to have that experience, and you increase your chances of it tenfold when you read, because this is what reading actually is, right? It's this preservation, this encounter with the mind, just as, all souls are encoded into a body, right, are inhabit bodies. Similarly, right, the human mind can't endure without some, physical instantiation of it. And that's what a book is. It's like taking these letters and this pulp and this tree and turning it into a vehicle, a vessel for a human mind. And so I had this experience, right, of opening this book, Poetic Diction. If you've never had an experience like this with a book, you will. The more you read, you will find some authors who are like this for you. And even if you know that some other authors are better, you will nevertheless forever cherish those particular authors because they become like your friends, right? Keats is one from my dad. Anyway, I had that experience with Barfield. And I had it because Lewis had also been my companion during this time while I was in grad school. I would walk by the river and I would read page after page of Lewis. And he's so, he's so snackable. Lewis's writing is so digestible. And he sent me, like, on a kind of treasure hunt to Barfield with this passage that I'm about to read to you. This is from his book Miracles, which is maybe people kind of sleep on miracles. I don't know. You'll have to write me and tell me. I think people, I've said before, people mostly know Lewis as like the Narnia guy. And then if they read his, nonfiction, they read Mere Christianity, or they read even, say, A Grief Observed, Surprise by Joy, Problem of Pain. Miracles is a little bit more philosophical. It's like kind of crib noting a lot of Aristotle and talking about the possibility of miracles and answering Hume and all this stuff. So people don't read it as much, but I love this one. I think this is one of his best. And it contains this brief reference to Poetic Diction, which was dedicated to Lewis. This was, again, as I mentioned, a very close relationship. And he says at one point, I must now touch on a subject which has an importance quite apart from our present purpose, and of which everyone who wishes to think clearly should make himself master as soon as he possibly can. This is the highest possible Lewis recommendation for listening to these episodes of Young Heretics. This is why I'm spending time with Barfield, is because he, like I said, he's a tool for understanding life, the universe, and everything. He's a companion in your attempt to do that. You ought to begin by reading Mr. Owen Barfield's Poetic Diction and Mr. Edwin Bevan's Symbolism and Belief. But for the present argument, it will be enough to leave the deeper problems on one side and proceed in a popular and unambitious manner. This is classic Lewisian humility. This is actually a very profound and useful way of dealing with some of the stuff that we've been talking about today. So he says, when I think about London, I usually see a mental picture of Euston Station. But when I think, as I do, that London has several million inhabitants, I do not mean that there are several million images of people contained in my image of Euston Station, nor do I mean that several millions of real people live in the real Euston Station. In fact, though I have the image while I am thinking about London, what I think or say is not about that image, and would be manifest nonsense if it were. It makes sense because it is not about my own mental pictures, but about the real London, outside my imagination, of which no one can have an adequate mental picture at all. Or again, when we say that the sun is 90-odd million miles away, we understand perfectly clearly what we mean by this number. We can divide and multiply it by other numbers, and we can work out how long it would take to travel that distance at any given speed. But this clear thinking is accompanied by imagining, which is ludicrously false to what we know that the reality must be. To think, then, is one thing, and to imagine is another. What we think or say can be, and usually is, quite different from what we imagine or picture. And what we mean may be true when the mental images that accompany it are entirely false. It is indeed doubtful whether anyone except an extreme visualist who is also a trained artist ever has the mental images which are particularly like the things he is thinking about. In these examples, the mental image is not only unlike the reality, but is known to be unlike it, at least after a moment's reflection. I know that London is not merely Euston Station. Let us now go on to a slightly different predicament. I once heard a lady tell her young daughter that she would die if you ate too many tablets of aspirin. But why? Asked the child. It isn't poisonous. How do you know it isn't poisonous? Said the mother. Because, said the child, when you crush an aspirin tablet, you don't find horrid red things inside it. Clearly, when this child thought of poison, she had a mental picture of horrid red things, just as I have a picture of Euston when I think of London. The difference is that whereas I know my image to be very unlike the real London, the child thought that poison was really red. To that extent, she was mistaken. But this does not mean that everything she thought or said about poison was necessarily nonsensical. She knew perfectly well that a poison was something which killed you or made you ill if you swallowed it, and she knew to some extent which of the substances in her mother's house were poisonous. If a visitor to that house had been warned by the child, don't drink that, mother says it is poison, he would have been ill-advised to neglect the warning on the ground that this child has a primitive idea of poison as horrid red things, which my adult scientific knowledge has long since refuted. You may be able to see where this is going, but we're leading here to how we think about and talk about God, that we're all in this position of this child. And indeed, this is what Aristotle means in part when he says that, thinking is not fantasia, it's not imagination, it's not visualization. And yet it never occurs without fantasia. We always are using these kind of inadequate mental pictures or these stand-in mental pictures, just as we are always using, sounds and language to stand in for these big experiences that we have in the world that are ineffable and beyond full encapsulation in any one matter. In our two previous examples, Lewis goes on, we have been concerned with thought and imagination, but not with language. I had to picture Euston Station, but I did not need to mention it. The child thought that poison was horrid red things, but she could talk about poison without saying so. But very often when we were talking about something which is not perceptible by the five senses, we use words which, in one of their meanings, refer to things or actions that are. When a man says that he grasps an argument, he's using a verb, grasp, which literally means to take something in the hands. But he is certainly not thinking that his mind has hands or that an argument can be seized like a gun. To avoid the word grasp, he may change the form of expression and say, I see your point, but he does not mean that a pointed object has appeared in his visual field. He may have a third shot and say, I follow you, but he does not mean that he is walking behind you along a road. Everyone is familiar with this linguistic phenomenon, and the grammarians call it metaphor. But it is a serious mistake to think that metaphor is an optional thing, which poets and orators may put into their work as a decoration, and plain speakers can do without. So if you have seen where this is going toward our creeds and our images of God, right? That we have this sense that the primitive idea of God is that he's sky daddy. You hear this all the time. God is sky daddy, right? You just have this idea of this bearded man up in the sky. And, even if that's not true of you, even if you have this more quote unquote spiritual idea of a bearded man up in the sky, you're reading a Stone Age text that comes from people who just thought that God literally was up there, right? And I've read to you many passages before in the course of this podcast that kind of show that this was not the vision in the medieval era, or in, the idea that God might be literally up there was not necessary for talking about God as if he were in the heavens, right? Beatrice says to Dante in the Paradiso that they, these beings show themselves to you here. You have this physical experience of them here. In order to stand in for some elevated nature that they have. At this stage, I must turn aside to deal with a rather simple-minded delusion, says Lewis. When we point out that what the Christians mean is not to be identified with their mental pictures, some people say in that case, would it not be better to get rid of the mental pictures and the language which suggests them altogether? But this is impossible. The people who recommend it have not noticed that when they try to get rid of man-like, or as they are called, anthropomorphic images, they merely succeed in substituting images of some other kind. I don't believe in a personal God, says one, but I do believe in a great spiritual force. What he has not noticed is that the word force has led in all sorts of images about winds and tides and electricity and gravitation. I don't believe in a personal God, says another, but I do believe we are all parts of one great being, which moves and works through us all. Not noticing he has merely exchanged the image of a fatherly and royal-looking man for an image of some widely extended gas or fluid. This always happens. In this capacity, it is interesting that what is the great sort of spiritual gelatinous idea that we all are familiar with from modern pop culture? The force, right? The force. It's not God, it's not Buddhism, it's not religion, but it is the force, right? And eventually we even get like midichlorians, right? We get this whole mythology about how this stuff works that seems kind of quote unquote more spiritual because the physical nature of it is hidden, right? And yet, Barfield's point, the reason that this book, Poetic Diction, is such an important inroad to talking about what we're going to deal with next week is that always, we are never able to escape the fact that form and matter, flesh and spirit, are entwined with one another. It happens in language, and it happens in language because it happens in thought. It happens in thought because it is the nature of our experience of reality, our encounter with the physical world and the outside world. And that is because creation itself is a language, is a form of poetic diction. That's going to be it for this week, but we're going to come back to this next week and start talking about quantum physics and so on and so forth. So, see you there. Let's take a melee. The job market is nuts. And if you are hiring, you need Indeed. People who run businesses are super busy. I know, because I have a lot of friends and even more listeners who run businesses. God bless you. You do incredible work, but you do not need to be spending hour after hour rifling through resumes. You have more important things to do. You're likely to get a lot of applications, and only a small portion of them are going to be ones that you want to interview. Indeed figures all of that out for you. They are the one-stop shop hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. So from the posting all the way up to the hiring, you are covered with Indeed. Soundfront uses Indeed to find a lot of its production talent. And let me tell you from personal experience, they are great people and great workers. Those both are important, by the way, is the company culture and the stuff they're going to do for you to help further your vision. That is why you need Indeed to help seek through the entire field and make sure you're getting the best people for your business and your brand. When you go to Indeed.com/heretics, you can claim a $75 job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/heretics. One more time, it's Indeed.com/heretics. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire. You need Indeed. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals, youngheretics.com/locals. You can come join our community if you like this show, and more than that, if you like the ideas that I was talking about today of meeting people in books, right? And coming to that kind of communion of minds that is so refreshing and kind of takes you out of your loneliness. Locals is a great place to be and to find like-minded people who care about the same sorts of things. We do a lot of talking on Locals about how to take these rather abstract ideas and live them out in our real lives. There's a weekly live stream Q&A called Office Hours every Friday. I am translating I'm translating Paul's letter to the Romans and writing some commentaries on it. There's lots going on there that you can only get if you are a Locals VIP. It's youngheretics.com/locals. Really hope you will join us. Okay, here's a mailbag question from VIP AJ. One of the main pet peeves I had with my college experience is that the Bible is not considered an academic source. Even when I transferred to a Christian college, I was allowed to reference the Bible, obviously, but I wasn't allowed to use it as one of the required amount of references I needed for a paper. Me being me, I went on to write a whole paper for an assignment about why the Bible should be considered an academic source. My basic argument was that the point of academia is to evaluate using truths and to seek truth, so it would follow that a book that is only true and gives the meaning of life should be considered an academic source. My teachers didn't give me a good grade. I've never heard an argument for it not being an academic source. It doesn't just sound like academic thinking academia ranks higher than religion. Okay, this is a really interesting question, obviously relevant to our present experience. There are kind of two ways to approach this, I think. And one is judging the Bible by academic standards, and one is judging academia by biblical standards, right? Lewis in Miracles makes a phenomenal point, which is he says, in the Bible, there are miracles reported. And often you see people arguing from the premise that those miracles aren't true, right? And Lewis's point is that if they were true, what evidence would we have except books like the Bible written by, in some cases, eyewitnesses, right? What would be the evidence except this sort of record, especially from antiquity? There were no video cameras, right? And so when you argue that, you've proven that Isaiah must be made of, written by multiple authors because it predicts things that were happening after Isaiah's life, you haven't proven anything. You've just taken a certain premise for granted. And I agree that is question begging, right? If you're trying to set out to answer the question, are miracles possible? At the very least, right, you would begin with an ambiguous, with an open mind to the yes or no answer, rather than evaluating things from, a premise that you have already decided upon on the basis of no evidence, right? And we do this to the Bible all the time. We say, well, this event can't literally be true because, the women would not have had this kind of authority at the time, right? And it's like, well, that's the whole point, right? This woman was being granted authority or being listened to and whatever. You can read an essay that I wrote in the Claremont Review of Books called God in Translation, in which I deal with some of this aspect of the thing. Then there's the other side of it, which is using the Bible to prove a point, right? Citing the Bible to prove a point. And I think there's kind of two different ways that you can go about this. One is to use the Bible as you would any other piece of literary evidence, right? We have, as John MacArthur is fond of pointing out, way more manuscripts of the Bible than of Homer, right? And so all the time we would say, well, Homer, said this, or the conglomerate of poets that created the Homeric poets, said this or whatever. Plato quotes Homer in this way, and we take it as read that we're right about that, even though there are plenty of opportunities for mistakes to slip into transmission, right? We basically accept, with some, arguments and controversies, we accept that these texts do represent reality. We accept that Julius Caesar existed because we read about it in books. That's the only kind of evidence that we have, plus, the material sources and seeing, pictures of him and stuff. If we accept those sorts of things, then I think we would be very justified to use the Bible in the same way, right? The Bible reports to us that a person named Jesus existed at a certain time. Josephus corroborates this evidence in many ways. I got into this hilarious argument on Twitter once with a guy who was trying to tell me that, the Bible is just completely untrustworthy as a source in this way. And that, to me, is pure prejudice. That is just ridiculous. It's obvious that the Bible has every right to be included among our sources from the ancient world. Then there is citing the Bible to win an argument. I know this is kind of a hard pill to swallow for people who, like me, believe the Bible is wholly true, and it sounds like you, AJ, you certainly can use that as a proof in your own life, right? You go to the Bible for truth once you have accepted that that's true, but it's not a very persuasive argument if you're citing the Bible to an audience that might contain people who haven't already accepted the premise. That's also question begging, right? To say, well, the Bible says, that the word of God is pure. The Bible says honor your father, and therefore, academically, it's proven that you should honor your father. We are also guilty of this. And if you're trying to persuade somebody to accept the Bible as absolute truth, it won't do to say, well, the Bible says X, Y, or Z, right? So that seems to me like an illegitimate use of the Bible as an academic source, is referring to its authority in order to ground its own authority. And there are some people who believe that the Bible can ground its own authority. I don't think that is the right way to understand the absolute truth of the Bible. I think we always bring to any book we read, we bring all sorts of knowledge that isn't contained within the book. How do you know how to read the words in the Bible? The Bible does not teach you the English or the Hebrew or the Greek language, right? You have to go away and find that information from the outside world and then bring it to the book. Similarly, right, the Bible is not, doesn't internally prove the authority of its own truths, except by confirmation with the outside world. You read it, you go look at the outside world. And academic arguments are one way that we might come to learn truths that we would then find reflected back at us in the Bible to confirm the truth of the Bible. So it's not that you need to judge the Bible according to academic standards, but you also can't, I don't think, bring the Bible in as a source of, philosophical truth and end an argument that way. You can certainly cite it as a view that exists. You can adopt it as your view and argue for it, but you can't use it as the argument ender in the way that we might want to in academic discourse. Hope that answers your question. Thank you for being a Young Heretics VIP. One more time, you can go to youngheretics.com/locals to become a VIP. I hope you will. We have lots of conversations like this. And that is it for me. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, where I work. You can find the Claremont Review of Books at ClaremontReviewBooks.com and the American Mind at AmericanMind.org. You can also donate to support the work that we do in defense of and recovery of the American idea at Claremont.org/donate. That's it for me. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.